Good evening, everybody. My name is Manuel Eisner. I'm the director of the Institute of Criminology, and it's my great pleasure here to welcome you all, friends, colleagues, visitors, and to see so many of you coming to this inaugural lecture given by Crewe, a good colleague, a great citizen of the Institute, a great academic, and a fantastic thinker. And I'm sure we will all enjoy this talk and the subsequent discussion. I'm going to hand over to Alison now, who's been, as all of you will know, for many, many years, a great colleague of Ben and of the Institute, and she will give an introduction of the background of Ben's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. And I'm not going to say a great deal. I just want to say a very few words, some of them personal, since you all know Ben and his credentials. He came to the Institute on a Newton Trust postdoctoral fellowship in 2001, learned his prisons research craft in Wellingborough. The then governor of Wellingborough is here in the audience somewhere. We're delighted to see Peter. And he's gone from strength to strength ever since. Those of you who know my office know I keep absolutely everything, and you'll be surprised to know I can usually find things. I managed to find yesterday the original letter that Ben wrote to me from Essex. I read it to him yesterday. I showed him yesterday. The only bit I wanted to draw to your attention, because I just thought it was so self-reflexively insightful, was that he ends it by saying, before my PhD, I received a double first in social and political sciences from Robertson College, Cambridge, a distinction in my MSc sociology from London School of Economics. I am a diligent and thorough researcher, interested in empirical work informed by theory. How true is that? So that's just lovely to revisit. So anyway, he's been a gift. He's been a gift to me. He's been a gift to the Prisons Research Centre and to the Institute since he settled into his stride. I almost wanted to plot a figure with two axes, like heavy light, to articulate his strengths and style. And he'd be in the best quadrant, of course, and very high on all sorts of things that matter, like depth, intelligence, sensitivity, professionalism, and leadership on the MST and on complex research projects. It's a joy to work with him as an outstanding colleague. I really couldn't have asked for a better scholarly companion. This evening, we celebrate his professorship, which he was awarded in 2019, just before the pandemic. So tonight's lecture and reception are fitting marks of both that achievement and our return to the world of real-world connection. Apart from all those who are online, who we also wish were here and warmly welcome from afar. So, Ben, we're all looking forward to what you have to say to us tonight and to the socialising afterwards. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for reading out a letter that made me seem like a massive show. Thank you, that was very nice. Felt a bit like a eulogy. The irony is I want to start as though it's a wedding, because in a way, I want to start by thanking everyone for being here. It is really, really nice to see an audience that sort of spans many different areas of my life, so family and friends and colleagues, and both former and current students. And at the risk of really making it sound like a wedding speech, I particularly want to thank those people that have travelled a long way to be here. Thank you very much. What I want to do today, and I'm very conscious of the different levels of prior knowledge about prisons among you, is talk through how, with a number of colleagues, I've developed a framework for describing what I'll be calling the texture of imprisonment, and talking about what I think that framework delivers. I came to the Institute in 2001. I'd been a PhD student at the University of Essex. I was supervised wonderfully by Sean Nixon, who is here. And I was advised by Eamon Carabine when I consulted him about a prison idea that had been stewing in my mind to contact Alison, which I did. And that proved very sage advice. And in those early years, Alison and I spent a lot of time in her car traveling to conferences and to prisons and talks and things like that. And the conversations that we had en route about prisons and the craft of researching them constituted a kind of advanced apprenticeship. And the themes of those discussions, the moral, social, and human complexities of imprisonment and the connections between them, provide the central thread for what I plan to discuss this afternoon. So as Alison said, my first project was a 10-month ethnographic study of a medium security men's prison, HMP Wellingborough. The governor, Peter Bennett, like many governors since, was generous enough to grant me access. And because, as I said so modestly in my letter, I was a thorough and diligent student, I'd read as much prison literature as I could find before I went, which meant that I had expected to encounter more hostility than I found between prisoners and prison officers. And there was some, of course, but not the seething antipathy or thick dividing line that I had anticipated. So men in Wellingborough, who had been in the system for some time, described a shift in the nature of penal power from something they characterised as hard and authoritarian to a form that was softer with more give. One of these men was Jason Ward, who is also here today. Jason's now Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Nottingham. He has given me permission to out his pseudonym. And he expressed it as follows. He said, "You don't exist right up against the authoritarian wall. You exist somewhere away from it, and there is a buffer zone in between. Back in the day, the system was pure authority. There was no giving it. So you did get the very us-them division, which has been eroded over the years to a certain degree. That shield has been removed slightly from your everyday contact with the prison." And although these changes seemed progressive, often they were described with a tone of ambivalence. There was less animosity and more humanity in the system, prisoners said, but power felt less predictable and more opaque. As Tommy said, in the past you could ask for something and you knew the answer. The answer was always no. There were no delusions, no dangling carrots saying, if you do this, you'll be rewarded at the end of it, but every time you do get closer, they move the goalposts. And other men described the ways that, with regard to what mattered to them most, which was their progression through the prison system towards freedom, they were regulated less by the officers with whom they had daily contact than by more abstract and anonymous forms of power. So for those who were serving indeterminate sentences, that meant the people involved in assessing their risk and writing their reports about them. And these were practices that rendered them in ways that they often disputed because they felt partial or distorted, but which they had to address in order to get out. And that required them to adopt a kind of avatar that was intelligible to the system, even if it didn't correspond with their self-image. So what was written down officially, the file, represented a distinctive mode of power, which was highly adhesive and often deferred in its effects. It was also experienced as sly and unmanly compared to the more direct authority of the past. So Jacob here says, they don't use the stick no more, they use the pen, you get me. Once the pen has written down something, that can be there for life. And Billy says, the power of the pen rules. It rules the prison. It's a slightly mixed metaphor. They stab you in the back with a keyboard. For prisoners on determinate sentences, incentive and early release schemes likewise pushed key decisions away from the wings and made power harder to influence. Prisoners often commented that staff were not in your face or on your back, but they were very much in control. Power was everywhere but nowhere, like a spider's web without a spider. It didn't so much weigh down on prisoners as wrap them up and require them to self-regulate. And many complained that it was no longer sufficient to just be obedient, so to just stay out of trouble. Instead, they had to actively demonstrate a form of engaged compliance. So George said, before you just did your time and got out. There was nothing required of you except to go to work. Whereas now it's down to the slightest little thing that should be. It's all tied in. Like there's a notice out there, don't fill a bucket from the hot water tap or you get a strike. You get 3 strikes, you're knocked down a level. You might lose your TV or a couple of visits, right down to the slightest different thing. It's all monitored. It's all tied in to your future. Or as Matt said, you used to just be left to your own devices. It was less comfortable, but you had more freedom. You didn't have all these courses and all that. As long as you didn't give them no bother, they'd just move you through the system. Many years earlier, David Downs and Roy King had advanced the concepts of the depth and weight of imprisonment. Depth, the idea of being consumed by the prison, referred to the degree of security and control, and the level of isolation from the outside world, mainly in terms of contact with people and agencies from the community, but also distance from release. Weight was about the feeling of the sentence bearing down on prisoners, so being a burden on their shoulders, and was principally shaped by how staff used their authority, as well as things like conditions, rights and privileges, access to work and education, and so on. And I felt that what was being described to me was something distinctive. It was a form of power that was intrusive because it encouraged prisoners to reconstruct themselves as different kinds of people. It was demanding because it required them to actively and visibly engage with their sentence. And it was all-encompassing because it demanded perpetual monitoring of personal conduct. It was not depth or weight, it was tightness. And while the primary focus of these forms of power was the prisoner's cognition and selfhood, it also had implications for prisoner social dynamics. Relationships with prisoners could constitute a form of risk. So as Pete said, you're judged by the company you keep. Many prisoners therefore policed who they associated with, they circumscribed their loyalties, and they were careful not to appear too influential within the prisoner community. So many social actions were no longer worth the risk of losing privileges or generating negative comments on file. So Max said, years ago, you wouldn't care 2 hoots about what you said in front of who. If you've got beef with someone now and you're on standard or enhanced, those are privilege levels, you don't want to lose that. It does make you think a bit. So I'm going to return to tightness later. For now, I want to turn to the concept of weight. In 2007, Susie Hulley, Claire McLean, Alison and I embarked on a comparative study of public and private sector prisons. And to assess their moral quality, we used the Measuring the Quality of Prison Life survey, which Alison and Helen Arnold had developed, by interviewing staff and prisoners about what mattered in prisons, and then transforming what they said into a set of measurable statements and dimensions. These matters, things like respect, fairness, personal development, safety, were the aspects of prison life that conventional indicators and performance data struggled to capture, but which reflected the moral and relational texture of prison life. So the everyday humanity and inhumanity that flowed through the ways that officers in particular exercised their authority and used their discretion. And I'm not going to go through these quotes, but as we see here, being greeted with courtesy when unlocked, being given sage advice in a time of crisis, being treated with concern, so in this first quote, being given a pillow that you're entitled to, were things that communicated moral worth in ways that were existentially significant. The quality of the 5 private prisons in our study varied enormously. Some were very good, some were not very good. But in a kind of collective thought experiment, we realized that were we to be deposited on a wing in any of the prisons in our study, we would know very quickly whether they were public or private because of a kind of lightness in the feel of the environment. The most significant aspect of lightness, so lightness in the private sector, was anchored in an orientation among private sector custodial officers that was, as you see in the left-hand side here, more humane, less cynical and punitive than we found in the public sector, where, as you see here on the right-hand side, attitudes were, in our terms, heavier. So we were left with a puzzle. Intuitively, lightness seemed like a good thing. But if all of the private prisons in our study were light, we had to account for the fact that some were rated very poorly by prisoners themselves. So as we wrote at the time, it's a mistake to equate lightness with quality if the environment is laissez-faire or dangerously under-policed. Light can mean unburdensome and easier to bear, but it can also mean insubstantial or deficient. These are characteristics that are undesirable in prisons. So the solution was to supplement this axis, light to heavy, with an additional one, absent to present. And absence and presence referred to the availability of officers, the depth and quality of their engagement with prisoners, their ability and willingness to police the environment, and their confidence and competence in using authority. And prisoners in the private prisons said that staff were generally nice people, but that this represented a narrow form of respect. Respectful treatment required that officers inhabited their authority, took prisoners' needs seriously, and protected them from their own weakness of will. And in this respect, prisoners were sophisticated evaluators of the flaws both in their environments and in themselves, noting that the absence of authority was not good. That mayhem was not a good thing, that the lack of authority was troubling for them, and that it made it hard to be good. Combining these axes helps us not only to describe the characteristic qualities of public sector prisons and private sector prisons. So at the time, public sector prisons were heavy presence, private sector ones were light absent. But also, and we were building here on Prisons and the Problem of Order by Richard Sparks, Tony Bottoms and Will Hay, it helps us think through the ways that different configurations of authority, different forms of weight, produce different effects. And so, supported by survey data, we were able to show that the quadrants could be ranked in terms of the degree of legitimacy that prisoners conferred on them. The least legitimate was heavy absent. This was where power was imposed oppressively, but without the kind of engagement that provided prisoners with protection. The Holy Grail, we said, was light present, the bottom right quadrant. And in those prisons, control was achieved interpersonally or relationally, i.e., through staff-prisoner interactions and engagement. And what we came to call dynamic authority meant staff knowing their prisoners, so their moods and preoccupations, and using their discretion accordingly. As with tightness, there were implications for prisoner social dynamics. So where staff authority was absent or deficient, other prisoners filled the gaps. And just to give a brief illustration here, this was reflected in responses to statements like, this prison is run by prisoners rather than staff, and also in this prison, there's a real pecking order between prisoners, with, as we'll see, a much higher proportion of prisoners agreeing, that's a bad thing, in the prisons where staff power was absent. Okay, third, depth. I suggested earlier that depth is defined in relation to security and control, so constraints on movement, searching practices, and so on. And that aligns it with the way that the England and Wales prison system is organised. So prisoners are categorised according to the risk that they would pose should they escape and the likelihood they might try to do so, and then they're held in conditions designed to minimise those risks. But that definition of depth is rather narrow, and I've argued that it's more helpful to think of depth as the distance or polarity between the prison and the outside world, with distance having a meaning that's almost literal, but also somewhat metaphorical. And to put this another way, depth is always relative to some sense of a surface, and that adds huge complexity both to how it's experienced. And I want to give 3 examples of that. The first is from Thomas Ugelvik and Zarina Dowse's analysis of Kongsvinger prison in Norway. Kongsvinger's minimum security wing was surrounded by a low fence, and it granted prisoners regular opportunities to sample life outside through forms of temporary release. So in that sense, it was objectively shallow. But for the foreign national prisoners who were held there, the surface was not always the freedom waiting just beyond the prison walls, but loved ones far away in other countries with whom contact was very difficult. Regardless of what we might call the objective shallowness of Kongsvinger, Ugelvik and Damser say, Many prisoners felt as if they were buried deep beneath the surface, far away from a life in another country that just carried on without them. Meanwhile, for the men whose loved ones now resided in Norway, release meant being deported, and thereby distance from the world that mattered most to them. Second example is from a broader research programme, which I've tried to summarise here, the Comparative study, comparing policymaking and prisoner experiences in England and Wales and Norway, which I conducted between 2014 and 2019 with Alice Irvins, Julie Lawson, Christian Mjorland, and Anna Schleer. So you get a brief sense of it here. For the deep end sub-study at the bottom, I interviewed, in England and Wales, I interviewed men being held in super secure units. So these were men considered too difficult or dangerous to be held on normal wings in high security prisons. So they were held in conditions that were objectively about as deep as it gets. So no movement off the wing, and in some units, basically no contact with other prisoners and very high levels of staff escort. And these men used a striking range of metaphors to describe their circumstances. So as you might expect, some used the terminology of burial, asphyxiation, or abandonment. So Jason said, you start to feel like you're suffocating, you feel claustrophobic. I'm starting to feel like the walls are closing in on me. Others, though, describe their conditions in terms of sanctuary or transcendence, and in doing so, they disputed or inverted the poles of liberty and constraint. So actually, metaphysically, I'm not here. Physically, I am, but metaphysically, I'm not. It's no different from being outside. My walls are smaller than yours, but you still have walls, you just can't see them. And Carl said, Carl sort of presented, I guess, a similar interpretation of the limit points of his confinement. He said, freedom is vast, it's your perception, I'm free here. Interestingly too, most men in these units describe having reasonably good access to the outside world. Several felt more cut off from the rest of the prison system than from the community itself. So Abir here said, you've got your phone and the TV and radio, but it's prison politics that you miss. Another described going to his prison segregation unit for dental treatment as the equivalent of going to Ibiza, indicating that it was the membrane between normal and extreme conditions rather than the boundary of the prison wall that felt most salient to him. And in fact, for many of these men, having such extreme sentence lengths meant that the outside world felt completely immaterial. So Liam said, the outside world is kind of irrelevant to me. I'll be in my 60s before I have any real chance of getting out. And Nick said, nothing exists for me outside these walls. The only thing that applies to me is custody. People outside have become not relevant to me anymore. My third example comes from a longitudinal study of men and women serving long life sentences from an early age. This was conducted with Susie Hulley and Serena Wright in 2 phases since 2013. Prisoners serving short sentences tend to describe prisons as not real, or to use Auger's term, a non-place. Non-places are spaces like airports or shopping centres where our presence is transient and where we have little investment in creating meaningful relationships. Among our participants, coming to terms with the sentence required a shift from seeing the prison as a non-place, somewhere unreal, and the outside world as real, to the opposite. So initially, despite being in high security, in other words, deep conditions, the outside world still felt vivid and tangible because they remained well connected to people and networks in the community. In contrast, when they described their prison experience, they used metaphors of hibernation or of life being frozen in time or on hold. 10 years later, the passage of time meant that despite being in conditions that were less controlled and secure, so less deep, their relationship with the world outside had become more distant and they felt more embedded in the prison system. So memories had faded, relationships had dwindled, and they'd come to realise that psychological survival required them to suppress thoughts about life beyond their current circumstances. So Justin said, to get through, I had to make prison my world. I distanced myself from everybody on the outside and just embraced what was around me. To quote Hudson, there's nothing there, he means outside. My family feels real in the prison, that's about it. Everything else out there doesn't mean anything to me. Another participant had, by the time of the second interview, read our publications, and he reflected to me on the idea of depth. He said the extent to which the initial phase of imprisonment felt disorientating related to the height of the plunge or plummet. So if you think about the depth of imprisonment, the plummet, the transition from life outside to life in prison, is going to depend on your life history and your previous traumas. So some people have gone from a low point in their life, whether that's addiction, being in an abusive relationship, or a sense of marginalization or disenfranchisement. He goes on, I had opportunities in life as I was growing up, so I wasn't burdened by a lot of those problems or traumas. And so for me, the fall has felt significant because it feels like I've lost a great deal. So I would argue that the depth of imprisonment in my situation is greater or feels greater as a result. And even if that analysis, I think, is questionable, it is true that prisoners with chronic drug histories, or female prisoners who in the community have been coercively controlled by men, often use metaphors of imprisonment to describe their lives in the community. And they portray their time in prison as less restrictive, sometimes almost liberating in comparison. So to quote, Kat here says, my ex was a bit of a stalker. When I'm in jail, I'm free of him. Reese says, when you're on drugs, you're not locked in a jail, but it just runs your life. It controls you. In here, I'm locked up, but drugs don't control me anymore. I feel quite free. So what have these examples shown? First, I think depth has a number of dimensions that are not always aligned with each other. That's partly in the sense, as King and McDermott demonstrated, that lower security prisons might have more searching practices, more restrictive searching practices than those that are higher security. But I think there's also something more subjective here. So this is stretching a metaphor to breaking point. Like a scuba diver, a prisoner can be close to land, but submerged deep below the surface, or they might be swimming just under the surface, but in open water many miles from land. So I'm using the idea of surface being contact with the world outside, and land meaning freedom. Second, matters of time and place are highly relevant to how deeply submerged one can feel. The amount of time already spent in prison, the amount left before release, and also the prisoner's sense of where the essence of their life is located and what kind of future awaits them. Third, the experience of depth is mediated by prior life experiences. So the extent to which imprisonment feels oppressive or restrictive is shaped by what prisoners feel distanced from, and the degree to which their life outside felt unconfined and unrestricted. And fourth, while it's possible to describe some features of depth objectively, this doesn't necessarily correspond with how it's subjectively felt, not least because people bring to bear on their situation forms of reflexive engagement that help them make sense of and sometimes cognitively transform their circumstances. And I want to dwell on this a bit because historically prison sociology has been more concerned with social dynamics than prisoners' interior existence. So the prison landings have been seen as where the action is, and comparatively less attention has been paid to the ways that prisoners reflect on their circumstances, what they're thinking about when they're alone in their cells. And that includes the offence itself, the thing it is that they have done. So in our study of prisoners serving life sentences, it was impossible to understand how our participants experienced and engaged with their sentence without understanding their feelings about having been involved in or convicted of murder. So for those who were not maintaining innocence, the implications of contributing to someone else's death were profound. And that led initially to deep forms of denial, and later produced prolonged forms of existential reflection about moral selfhood and culpability. So Kelvin says, it's just so painful for me, I couldn't just bear to say, yeah, I did it. Because obviously that night it wasn't just the one person that died, it felt like part of me died as well. And typically, despite having been given life-endingly long prison terms, our participants found it much harder to come to terms with their offence than with the sentence. So to put that another way, what consumed them most was not the prison, but, to use Susie Hulley's term, the moral weight of murder. And these weren't just internal preoccupations. Feelings of shame also shaped people's behaviours within prison, how they spent their time, who they chose to mix with, and so on. So this is Nathaniel, who said that he would never come to terms with the murder he had committed, and explained that his use of the gin was a way of trying to prevent himself being flooded with thoughts about it. So he says, I've never come to terms with it, and I don't think I'll ever come to terms with it. And I asked, how much time do you spend thinking about the offence? He said, well, I suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, so mostly all the time. That's why I scrub my cell out 5 times a day. I go down the gym, throw the weights around as much as I can, just try anything to take my mind off it. I tire myself out. Then when I hit my pillow, I'm not thinking about it. I'm out cold, I'm gone. And so attempts at sense-making, self-reconstruction and redemption also drove a very common commitment to forms of faith and education, but also to particular modes of ethical practice. So Mahmoud here says, I made a vow to myself that I'm going to sort my life out, and I dedicated myself to religious learning, and it's turned my life around. The way I do that is to look on my errors, mistakes, and try to make amends. I think my spirituality helped me soften that blow to accept what I'd done was wrong. So faith and education provided explanation, hooks for change, ways of understanding one's place in the world. In one of the other sub-studies in the Comparative project between England and Wales and Norway, we focused on men convicted of sexual offences. And again, moral dynamics were very significant. For such men, as my colleague Alice Evans has shown, the feel of imprisonment was defined in all kinds of ways by what these men had been convicted of and how their moral status was reflected back to them. So often they felt profound shame. They felt scorned by prison officers whose relationships with them were permeated by disapproval and mistrust. And they felt stained by being around other men whose crimes disgusted them. And this produced a kind of avoidant and neurotic social world pervaded by moral judgment, like a hall of mirrors with prisoners, this is to quote from our article, looking at themselves, looking at others, and looking at others, looking at them. Shame and guilt are sometimes referred to as self-conscious emotions, evoked by self-reflection and self-evaluation. But in the context of criminal justice, the nature of these feelings is very obviously shaped by an ongoing dialogue between what people feel about what they've done and how the prison system communicates to them about their moral status and culpability. And that too varies between prisons and prison systems in terms of things like the demands that are made and the forms of support that are offered regarding how prisoners consider matters relating to their offending. And this has led me and Alice Evans to reconsider the concept of tightness. So initially, my assumption was that being kind of gripped by the institution was oppressively invasive and unwanted. But recent work has made it much more obvious to me that being ungripped is also undesirable if it means being forsaken. So many prisoners genuinely want help with things like substance misuse problems or anger issues or sexual drives that they find hard to repress, and they welcome rather than resent intrusive institutional efforts to reconstruct who they are and their moral conduct. So to quote Frank, I recognise the need to change because even when I was doing the thing I was doing, I didn't want to do them. I didn't want to be the person that I was. Other people's reasoning is more instrumental. They just know that they have to do courses if they want to move through the system, whether they truly want to or not. But whichever the case, it's not undesirable to be gripped and monitored, but to be ungripped and unnoticed. And the most advanced representation of this comes from Toy Story. Now, this is the bit where the technology is going to have to work. Here we go. The claw.
Your vessel to Sector 12. Who's in charge here?
The Claw is our master. Claw chooses who will go and who will stay.
That's him saying, this is ludicrous. Not, I hope, a comment on my analysis.
The Claw, it moves. I have been chosen. Farewell, my friends. I go on to a better place. Gotcha.
Well, thank you to Joe Ashmore for pointing that out. So Alice and I therefore offered a new reading of tightness, noting that prison systems can be loose or lax as well as tight, when the risk bureaucracy is inconsistent or inefficient, when it's impossible to access interventions or specialists, for example, because courses simply aren't available in the prison that you're in, where there's too little rather than too much attention paid to offence-related issues, or where the prisoner's problems are deemed irresolvable or ineligible for intervention. There's something particularly egregious, I think, about a prison system that is demanding yet deficient. That's this bottom right quadrant, what I would call, I think, synthetic rehabilitation. So you must reduce your risk in order to progress, but we aren't able to help you do that. And in effect, you'll be penalised for that. There's something alienating too about being misrecognised, or to draw on Fergus McNeill's idea of the malopticon, being seen badly and being seen only as bad. So prisons in this quadrant demands a great deal from prisoners. And as in my initial formulation of tightness, they impose labels and classifications that prisoners might dispute because they see people mainly through a lens of risk. So this comes close to what Rotman calls authoritarian rehabilitation, others have called coercive correctionalism. But it is less illegitimate, at least, if resources are in place that allow prisoners to address those risks. Whether it's more or less legitimate than containment, so being neglected or abandoned when crying out for forms of intervention and support, might depend on a prisoner's preference for positive or negative forms of liberty. So the value attached either to being left alone or to being given opportunities for self-realisation, growth. Other forms of grip might be embraced and are felt to be more legitimate where they entail some form of recognition. So where prisoners feel that the authorities are engaging properly with their needs and aspirations and are supporting their personal development. So this is closest to what Rotman calls humanistic rehabilitation, and others have more recently called things like assisted desistance. I wonder if it's the opposite of the malopticon. So being seen well and being regarded as good, the bonopticon. I have to look up the right Latin word. So this is the overall framework. I'm not going to say anything more really about breadth. That's the impact or shadow of the sentence beyond the point of custody, because that remains the least developed part so far, but we're working on it. The hangover seems to be the metaphor we want to use for that. Instead, I want to move on to the second part of this lecture, which is the matter of what all of this amounts to and what I mean by this term, texture. I think the term is apt because just as a strip of satin or sandpaper has certain textural properties based on its material composition, it also has a sensory quality. The term texture therefore implies both a set of objective characteristics, but also a more subjective sense of how those characteristics feel. And this focus on the feel of imprisonment is very deliberate. During our comparative penology study, we sought advice from a colleague on the translation of our interview questions from English to Norwegian. This was a Danish colleague who expressed surprise that so many of our questions asked participants how they felt. She also said she thought that mode of questioning was a bit too personal for a Nordic sample. That's another matter. But that form of questioning reflects a commitment in my work and in the work of the Prisons Research Centre to a humanistic or person-centred social science and to representing people, as Elijah Anderson puts it, in a way that without undue abstraction or sentimentality is faithful to their understanding of themselves. Alison, drawing on George Eliot, calls this authentic description. So getting as close as possible to capturing real human feelings and experience and the inner state of others. And I think as well as that, the human and moral dimensions of imprisonment. And so I think this should involve probing and taking seriously the ways that people engage in forms of reflection and deliberation about who they are and what they've done, and the circumstances that confront them, and the courses of action they choose within the limitations of these contexts. This is what Margaret Archer calls the internal conversation that mediates structure and agency. Others refer to it as people's ultimate concerns and ground projects, so the preoccupations that provide people with meaning and which drive their actions. I think the more objective dimension of texture is useful both descriptively and comparatively. And in that respect, the framework that I'm offering provides a vocabulary for delineating the different aspects of penal power that I've outlined so far. And here it helps contribute to a growing body of work that take issue with the claim made by Gresham Sykes in The Society of Captives, a kind of the foundational text, I think, of prison sociology, that custodial institutions share basic similarities that override variations of time, place, and purpose. A number of scholars have argued recently that it's true that prisons share some inherent qualities in that they deprive people of liberty and limit their mobility and so on. But at least as striking is the staggering variation that exists between prisons in terms of things like their moral quality, their forms of governance and order, and the degree to which prisoners are regulated and their community marked by cohesion and solidarity. So again, to quote Ugelvik and Damser, the differences between a huge US supermax prison and a much smaller, low-security Norwegian institution are so many and run so deep that one could question if it makes sense to refer to them by the same term. The question then is how these institutions differ and the coordinates that help us characterize their qualities. And here I think the language of depth, weight, tightness, and breadth provides a kind of conceptual scaffolding. And I want to use the example of open prisons to briefly demonstrate this point and to highlight how texture alerts us to both objective and subjective elements of imprisonment, though I'm not claiming that those elements are easily or cleanly separable. Open prisons are low security establishments without significant perimeter or internal security. Their objectives include helping prisoners decompress from closed conditions and assisting them in their reintegration into the community. So typically they offer quite a lot of autonomy and they allow many prisoners to leave each day to do things like work in the community. But prisoners often describe these environments as hazardous, demanding, and insecure. Low staffing levels and an environment that offers conditional trust mean that the authority of officers is not overbearing and the environment is only lightly policed, but power flows through other means, mainly through risk assessment and monitoring, which determine decisions about temporary and permanent release. And meanwhile, the absence of normal security features, alongside the threats of being returned to closed conditions, should they slip up, requires that prisoners self-regulate much more than they have to in more secure and controlled establishments where control is done much more by the institution. So in the language of the framework, we can probably describe these establishments as shallow in the sense that they're permeable, freedom is relatively near. They are light absent, that quadrant, but they are tight. And qualitative account of open prisons suggest that these establishments produce a distinctive set of pains and difficulties. So Victor Shamus, for example, has detailed what he calls the pains of freedom, a set of frustrations caused by being almost but not quite free. So in a kind of liminal position between contrasting worlds, but still subject to a good deal of power. In our study of life sentence prisoners, early in their sentence, our participants talked about open imprisonment not just as the final stage of their sentence, but as a kind of end point. So the point at which they were in effect free. So Harris says, when I go to Cat D, that's open conditions, I class that as being home. However, once they were there, they often came to see this as a false dawn, the most difficult point of the sentence. So Harold, who was well over tariff and was in an open prison, described it as a gilded budgie cage and explained what he called the torment of open conditions. So he said, by Christ, this is the hardest thing I've ever gone through, Cat D. It's all I can do not to just get shipped out and back to closed conditions. And I very nearly did that myself. I said, look, I can't put up with this anymore. I'm sick of chasing the carrot. And Serena asked him, but you're so close. He said, I am not, and that's the torment. It is torture. You can't see the bars, but I can. Now, Victor Chamas's conclusion about such matters is that even exceptional degrees of liberty are never unproblematic. And he says the following: while viewing prison conditions through the optic of humane or inhumane conditions arguably produces a flattening one-dimensional gaze, the task of prison scholars might better be understood as studying how penal power, punitive power, varies in kind rather than degree, how the nature of pain imposition varies qualitatively. And I agree more or less with what I've highlighted in red, because I think simple evaluative conclusions about whether prisons are good or bad, or whether some are preferable to others, are quite difficult, not impossible, but difficult. And that's partly because prisons can be good or bad in different ways. So a prison might, for example, be extremely restrictive, but at the same time have quite genial and professional staff-prisoner relationships. It's also because overall judgments are not straightforward. Terms like good and bad are a bit too reductive. So is a prison that is run by prisoners rather than staff, but which allows extended family visits and unregulated movement, as is found in some Latin American countries, so kind of absent but shallow. So is that better than one that's safer but more restrictive, present but deep? Is loose containment preferable to tight correctionalism? So at the very least, I think terms like depth, weight, and tightness offer an alternative terminology. I'm only partially persuaded by the second half of this claim, that the pains or experience of imprisonment are therefore incommensurable, that they are very difficult to compare across prisons or across jurisdictions. And I think the second contribution of the framework is therefore precisely its potential to enable comparative analyses of imprisonment, however imperfect, and to bridge a divide between macro-level accounts of punishment and micro-level studies of everyday prison life. So Nicola Lacey has said micro-level studies, which are normally really detailed accounts of single institutions, are rather inhospitable to comparative approaches because their focus is very local and very particular. Conversely, a limitation of macro studies, so the kinds of studies that are looking at broad trends in things like punitiveness or are comparing different kinds of penal systems, is their tendency to rely on metrics like imprisonment rates or indicators like cell size or levels of overcrowding, or inputs like length of staff training or hours of purposeful activity. And those measures are really useful and important. But for researchers like me and lots of other people in this room and online, because our heads are mainly inside prisons looking out rather than outside looking in, it seems really obvious that these sorts of measures only get us so far in capturing the nature and experience of imprisonment, or levels of mildness and severity. It's perfectly possible, after all, that a country could lock up relatively few people, so its imprisonment rate might be low, but in really punitive or harsh conditions. So the framework that I've elaborated might help bridge these approaches, because it allows us to classify prisons along a range of dimensions that focus less on official inputs or practices and more on the textual qualities that those inputs and practices produce. One further point before I'm going to illustrate that. Studies of the effects of imprisonment have for many years been dominated by Sykes's account of the pains of imprisonment. So Sykes lists the deprivation of liberty, goods and services, heterosexual relations, autonomy and security. In a recent article, Kevin Haggerty and Sandra Bucerius have argued that as scholars have applied this concept to an expanding range of domained groups and practices, it's become so extended as to have become dulled and diluted, because the same term ends up being applied to aspects of prison life that, to quote them, fall somewhere on a continuum of excruciating, traumatic, uncomfortable, unwelcome, embarrassing, and inconvenient. These are really important distinctions. So that might range from sexual abuse to things that are more like administrative hassles, or even practices that look ostensibly progressive, like opportunities to undertake work in the community. And Haggerty and Bucerius are not, I think, arguing that studying such matters is redundant, but that the language of pain is unhelpful because it compresses everything into a single category. And they say few studies seek to differentiate between the relative significance or painfulness of these pains, leaving them what they call an unranked mass. Everything's as painful as everything else. I think an alternative way of saying this is that Sykes's account does not cover all of the pains of imprisonment, that not all prison experiences are equally painful, and that not all of them are best described as pains. In recent projects, the Lifer project and the Comparative project, we've given out surveys which ask prisoners to assess the severity of a range of problems that they might encounter. And that does enable us to compare both between different kinds of pains and also different prisoner subgroups. So here, this slide is just designed to show you different ways in which we've been able to assess this. So these are the 5 problems, the 5 problems rated as most severe by a range of groups, as you'll see along the top row. And what I hope the colour coding shows you is the extent to which problems like missing somebody, feeling that your life is being wasted, missing social life, worrying about people outside, feeling that you've let down your family and friends, feature across these groups. There's a huge amount of consistency here, and that in itself is obviously quite instructive. So what feels painful seems pretty invariant across these groups and across these jurisdictions. Here we're just looking at open and closed prisons in England and Wales and Norway, and again we see really striking regularity. The same issues. This just shows similar data. Here we've organised it by categories of pains or problems. And problems were, what this shows is that problems were felt most acutely, firstly in closed prisons in England and Wales, that's the blue line, then closed prisons in Norway, that's orange, then open prisons in England and Wales in grey, and then open prisons in Norway in yellow. That's sort of what we would expect. Firstly, it's telling us that one thing it's telling us is that there is variation in the severity or intensity of these pains or problems, as I say, in the direction you might expect. But there's little variation in terms of the substance, the nature of those pains or problems. So to quote Christian Mjolin, Julie Lawson, Anna Schleer, and Simon Lama, that contrary to the qualitative literature, which I briefly mentioned, that documents the specific pains experienced by prisoners in open prisons, there is little in our survey data that supports the idea that open prisons produce a distinct set of pains. But they are very careful to suggest that this does not, they don't suggest that this refutes existing work documenting the pains of freedom. Rather, they say it should encourage further research, that's what we always say, as well as methodological debate. One issue then, I think, is that exploring pains and problems is too limited. So data of this kind, I'm showing you that slide again, actually tells us very little about what imprisonment is actually like or how it varies, or at least it doesn't tell us as much as we might think. And it risks giving a false impression of institutional and experiential similarity. And that is partly because these problems are not, if you look at them, about institutional treatment. They are about existential feelings internal to the prisoner, so sorrow and self-reproach, or they're about matters that are external to the prison, so people and life out there. Even if these matters are very similar, anyone that has been into prisons in these sorts of countries or different sorts of prisons knows that there is a real difference in feel between prisons holding these different kinds of populations. So while I sort of realised, I saw some articles that said that my framework was about the pains of imprisonment, and I was really cross. And then I realised that's what I had called it, this article. But I think texture is a much more productive concept because it suggests a much more sort of differentiated topography of experience. So, quickly, to return to open and closed prisons in England and Wales and Norway, here I'm just showing, I'm trying to simplify the data a bit, I'm just showing the percentage of prisoners agreeing or strongly agreeing with a selection of statements that we developed to try to operationalise these dimensions, including depth, weight, tightness, and breadth. The survey was imperfect, it was just a first attempt, but not unproductive, I think. Certainly the data give us a much stronger sense of what I would call the kind of textural consistency of these prisons. And I'll admit to a bit cherry picking, so I am sort of illustrating a point here, but the attempt is to sort of support the case I'm making around the ideas that I have set out. So first, this is just 2 items from the weight dimension. So second one is to start on this prison to think that prisoners are morally beneath them. But the first one is where we see some particularly striking differences in responses. So I feel cared about most of the time in this prison. 76% agreeing in open prisons in Norway, 47% in closed prisons in Norway, compared to 29% in closed prisons in England and Wales, 35% in open prisons in England and Wales. And I think this is indicative of different philosophies of practice and different philosophies of personhood in the 2 jurisdictions. We also find really substantial differences in relation to this statement, drugs cause a lot of problems between prisoners in here. So almost 3 times as many prisoners agreeing in closed prisons in England and Wales as closed prisons in Norway. So that is just a really different kind of world to be held in. If we look at items from depth, we find higher levels of agreement in England and Wales than Norway for the item, I have no control over my day-to-day life in here. So that seems consistent with Norway's commitment to the normality principle. That's the idea that life in prison should resemble life in the community as much as it's possible. Findings for I feel cut off from the outside world in here, and you can't quite read this bottom one, I feel a long way from freedom, are much less divergent, and I think that points to some of the subjective elements of depth that I have discussed. So in particular, despite being in shallow conditions, open prison, so close to release and often spending time in the community, really quite a high proportion of prisoners in the open prisons in both England and Wales and Norway felt distanced both from the community and from their own liberty. Here I've just included a few items from the tightness dimension, and it's really clear that prisoners in Norway feel less gripped than those in England and Wales, and that reflects a much greater preoccupation in England and Wales with risk. The other thing to notice is that there's so little difference between closed and open prisons in England and Wales. In fact, for one of the statements here, in this prison you have to walk on eggshells, a higher proportion agree in the open prisons than the closed prisons. All of this gets us further in terms of discerning the properties of these prisons and representing them faithfully. So what it's like to be in them, to be addressed by them as a human and moral agent. Just click on this. And how this differs between prisons and jurisdictions. And these differences really matter. So Esther van Hinnigan has demonstrated using this data set that the dimensions of depth, weight, and tightness explain variance in punishment and degradation. And as we see here, for some items, these differences in feelings of the degree to which the experience is painful, feels harmful, and is humiliating, vary really substantially. And I think this analysis helps us reconcile disparities between previous studies of open imprisonment, because it seems to me that it can be true that the pains and problems of being in open conditions are less acute than those in closed, and that open prisons can be described as objectively lighter and shallower. But it can also be true that experienced subjectively, this sentence phase feels particularly challenging because it's inconsistent with prior expectations, because you're tantalizingly close to freedom, but you're not free. In places because the environment is lacking in moral sympathy, and because people are gripped by fears about being returned to closed conditions or anxieties about the kind of life that awaits them when they're released. So I want to finish by very briefly suggesting some next steps of prison sociology that I think this work suggests in itself. The first, I think, is to expand outwards towards a macro-penology that not only describes how the texture of imprisonment varies, but is also explanatory. So why do some jurisdictions have prison systems that are consistently less deep or less tight than others? The second is to develop a clearer sense of why texture matters. And I think there's considerable scope here to revive a set of rather dormant questions about what determines prison, the shape and nature of prison social life and culture. So in our comparative study, for example, we were struck by some of the similarities between the flow of power in prisons holding women and prisons holding men convicted of sexual offences. And this, I think, was based on assumptions about gender and risk and particular modes of moral regulation. And it produced quite similar dynamics within the prisoner community, where power flowed through information and lateral regulation. So prisoners being monitored almost as much by each other as by the institution. And I think these sorts of matters deserve serious and systematic attention. Third, we should ask how different forms of texture contribute to penal legitimacy and illegitimacy, or to alienation and damage, or to remorse and repair. So in her recent analysis of high security prisons, Alison has demonstrated that degrees of anger among prisoners, levels of ethnic and religious integration between them, and the extremity of individual faith identities are shaped by how prisoners are addressed as moral agents. And it's an account that by pulling together the interplay between the normative, the social, and the human dimensions of prison life presents an important blueprint for further research. The best prison researchers, I think, are attuned to that interplay, and I do feel extremely lucky to have worked in a prisons research centre and with many colleagues who are sensitised to those things, and therefore make the rather difficult and delicate task of prison research so much more manageable. That includes the people I've mentioned today and many others beyond it, including lots of people in this room and online today. So I'm enormously grateful as well to the broader academic and administrative staff here at the Institute, and also to the outstanding PhD and master's students who I've taught and learned from over the years. Thank you.